Clara Whitmore pressed her hand flat against the train window and watched the world she'd left behind disappear into the distance. She was 29 years old, carrying everything she owned in one suitcase and wearing her best dress for a man she had never met. She was going to be a wife. She was going to have a home. She was going to finally matter to someone. She had no idea she was already a widow. If this story moves you, stay until the end. Drop your city below. Let me see how far this reaches. The train pulled into Red Hollow just past noon on the hottest day of that summer. Clara felt the heat before the doors even opened. A heavy, pressing wall of it that came through the wooden slats and settled into her lungs like something living. She straightened her collar. She smoothed her skirt. She picked up her suitcase with both hands because the leather handle had worn thin and the left strap was already threatening to give. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times on the 3-day journey west. She would step off the train. Nathan Doyle would be standing on the platform. He would be wearing the brown hat he described in his third letter, the one with a small brass pin on the brim. She would know him immediately. He would know her. They would shake hands, and it would be awkward, and maybe she would laugh a little too loud, the way she always did when she was nervous. And he would smile, and it would be the beginning. That was what she had rehearsed. What she got instead was silence. The platform was nearly empty when she stepped down. A few horses tied at the far post. An older man sweeping sawdust near the depot door. 2 women in faded calico dresses standing together under the narrow strip of shade near the water barrel, watching her with an expression Clara recognized instantly. Pity dressed up as curiosity. She looked down the length of the platform. No brown hat. No brass pin. She waited 3 full minutes before she set her suitcase down and walked toward the depot window. The clerk inside was a thin man with sunburned ears and eyes that kept moving to something past her shoulder, like he was hoping someone else would handle this. "Excuse me," Clara said. "I'm looking for a man named Nathan Doyle. He was supposed to meet me here. She stopped, swallowed. "I'm his intended, Clara Whitmore." The clerk's hands went still on the papers he'd been sorting. He looked at her then, really looked at her. And whatever he saw, the travel dress, the thin suitcase, the careful way she was holding herself together, it made his face do something complicated. "Miss Whitmore," he said slowly. "You didn't receive the telegram." "What telegram?" He set the papers down entirely. "You'd better come inside." She didn't cry. That surprised her afterward, how completely she didn't cry. The clerk, whose name she never asked and wouldn't remember anyway, told her the facts in the flat, careful way a person talks when they're afraid of what the words might do. Nathan Doyle had been found 2 mornings ago at the edge of his own property, with 2 bullets in his chest. His ranch house had burned the same night. The sheriff was calling it a robbery gone wrong. Most of the town believed the sheriff about as far as they could throw him, but nobody was saying that out loud. Clara stood on the other side of the wooden counter and listened to all of it without making a sound. When the clerk finished, she asked one question. "Where is he buried?" "Out at the edge of the Doyle property, what's left of it." "Thank you," she said, and she picked up her suitcase and walked back out into the heat. Red Hollow was not a welcoming town. She understood that within 20 minutes of walking its main street. The buildings sat low and square and dusty, baking in the merciless July sun. The saloon was the largest structure by a significant margin, which told you something about the town's priorities. There was a general store with a handwritten sign in the window. Cash only, no exceptions. and a small church at the far end of the street that looked like it hadn't been painted since before the war. People looked at her. Not the polite glance of a community welcoming a newcomer. They looked at her the way people look at something that's going to cause them trouble, and they're already tired in advance. Clara kept her chin up. She had learned that early, from her mother, from the factory floor in Cincinnati, where she'd spent the last 4 years. From every room where someone had made her feel like she didn't belong. You kept your chin up, and you kept moving, and you did not give anyone the satisfaction of watching you fold. She pushed open the door of the general store. The man behind the counter was heavy-set, with a thick gray mustache and small eyes that assessed her like she was merchandise. "I need to ask about lodging," Clara said. "A boarding house or a room somewhere?" "Widow Ferris used to rent rooms," the man said. He didn't move from his spot. "She's not taking boarders anymore." "Is there anywhere else?" "Not in Red Hollow." Clara set her suitcase down and looked at him steadily. "Sir, I just arrived on the noon train. I've been traveling for 3 days. I have nowhere to go, and I'm asking you for information, not charity. Is there a boarding house in this town or not?" He picked up a rag and began wiping the counter with the careful attention of a man who had decided he was done with this conversation. "Told you. Nowhere." The door behind her opened, and she heard boots on the floorboards. "Henderson." The voice was a woman's, low and dry as creek gravel. "Is that any way to treat someone who just got off a train?" Clara turned. The woman was perhaps 60, wire-thin, with white hair pinned back so severely it pulled the skin around her temples. She was carrying a basket of dry goods and looking at the man behind the counter with the particular expression of someone who had run out of patience for a specific person several years ago. "I'm just telling her how it is, Ruth," the man said. "You're just being unpleasant because that's your natural state." The woman set her basket on the counter and turned to Clara. "Ruth Alderman. I keep a house at the end of Church Street. It's small, and it's plain, and the roof is better on one side than the other. But you're welcome to the back room until you sort yourself out." Clara looked at her. "Why?" Ruth raised an eyebrow. "Why what? Why would you offer that to a stranger?" Ruth glanced at Clara's suitcase, then back at her face. "Because you came to marry Nathan Doyle, and Nathan Doyle is dead. And this town already ran off 2 other women who came here under hard circumstances, and I'm tired of being ashamed of the place I live." She picked up her basket. "You coming or not?" Clara picked up her suitcase. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." Ruth's house was exactly what she'd described. Small, plain, lopsided toward the east side where the porch roof sagged. But it was clean and it was cool inside, and there was a pitcher of water on the table in the back room, and Clara drank 3 glasses straight before she sat down on the narrow bed and let herself breathe. She didn't cry then either. She thought about it. She took stock of what was available to cry over. Nathan Doyle, a man she'd exchanged 11 letters with, a man who'd described his land with something close to tenderness, a man who'd written, "I think you and I might understand each other," which was the closest thing to a love letter she'd ever received. He was dead. His house was ash. And she was sitting in a stranger's back room in a town that had looked at her like a problem to be solved. She thought about Cincinnati, the factory, the room she'd rented from Mrs. Prentice on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled permanently of coal smoke and boiled cabbage. The way her supervisor had looked at her on her last day when she told him she was leaving to get married. "You sure about that?" he'd said, in the tone of a man who was sure she wasn't. She had been so sure. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and held them there for a count of 10. Then she stood up, splashed water on her face, and went to find Ruth. Ruth was in the kitchen, moving around the small space with the efficiency of a woman who had lived alone for a long time and made peace with it. "What happened to him?" Clara asked. Ruth set down the pot she was carrying and turned. She looked at Clara for a moment like she was deciding something. Then she pulled out a chair at the small table and sat down and nodded at the chair across from it. Clara sat. "This town has a problem," Ruth said. "His name is Wade Cutter. He's been the sheriff here for 6 years, and in those 6 years, he's managed to quietly push out every rancher or homesteader who sits on land worth having. Some sold for almost nothing because he made things too difficult to stay. Some had accidents." She paused. Nathan Doyle didn't have accidents, and he didn't sell. "So they killed him." "I can't prove that. Nobody in this town will say that out loud. But yes, that's what most people believe." Clara absorbed this. "What does he want with Nathan's land?" Ruth folded her hands on the table. "That I don't know. But Wade Cutter doesn't want anything unless it's worth considerable money. Nathan's land is rocky and dry. Didn't look like much." She tilted her head. "There may be more to it than that. And now they know I'm here." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Word travels fast in the small town. Clara looked at the window. The afternoon light was hard and yellow and relentless. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. It wasn't the question she was accustomed to asking. She'd spent most of her adult life not asking it, because the answer was always something she didn't like or couldn't afford. But she was in a foreign place, and she was tired, and Ruth Alderman had offered her a room for no reason except decency, and decency deserved honesty. Ruth looked at her carefully. "I think you should be very careful, and I think you should not go near the sheriff's office." "I wasn't planning to." "Good." They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, a horse went past at a slow walk. The heat pressed against the windows like something waiting to be let in. "Did you love him?" Ruth asked. "Nathan?" "I didn't know him," Clara said. "I wanted to." She picked a thread from the edge of her sleeve. "I think I could have." Ruth nodded once. Something in her face softened just slightly. "That might be the saddest thing I've heard in a while." "It might be," Clara agreed. She slept badly that first night. The heat didn't break after dark the way she'd hoped. It just shifted, became something heavier and closer. And she lay on the narrow mattress, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the town settling. Distant voices from the saloon. A dog somewhere. The creak of the house in what little wind there was. She thought about the 11 letters. Nathan had written well. Better than she'd expected from a frontier rancher. His third letter was the one she'd kept in her coat pocket for the whole journey. Worn soft at the folds now. The ink slightly smudged from where she'd read it in the rain once, waiting on a platform in St. Louis. "I've been working this land for 8 years, and I still find things about it that surprise me," he'd written. "I think a person who can still be surprised is a person worth knowing. I hope you're that kind of person, Miss Whitmore." She had read that sentence 4 times. She had thought, "Yes, I am exactly that kind of person." She had written back, "I believe the capacity for surprise is the most important thing a person can hold on to. I have held on to it stubbornly for 29 years, and I don't intend to stop." He had written back 2 days later, "Then I think we'll get along just fine." She pressed the letter flat on the mattress in the dark and stared at the ceiling. "We'll get along just fine." She closed her eyes and didn't sleep until nearly dawn. The next morning, she made a decision. She was going to the Doyle property. She told Ruth over breakfast, plain cornbread and black coffee, both of which Clara ate and drank with genuine gratitude. Ruth looked at her over the rim of her cup. "I thought I told you to be careful." "You did. I'm going to be careful." Going out to what's left of Nathan's land alone in the middle of July is not careful. I'm not going to do anything. Clara set down her cup. I just need to see it. I need to see the place he wrote to me about. He described it in every letter. The ridge that catches the morning light, the creek that runs cold even in summer, the way the mountains look at sunset. She looked at Ruth steadily. I know it sounds foolish. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Take the road north, not the one by the mill. The mill road goes past Cutter's range and his men ride it regular. She stood and took the cups to the basin. And take water. The heat out there today is going to be murderous. The road north was empty in the early morning. Clara walked it with her skirts tied up above her ankles and her hair pinned under the wide-brimmed hat Ruth had pressed on her at the door. The sun was already high and mean, and the dust on the road was fine as powder and got into everything: her shoes, the folds of her dress, the back of her throat. She walked for an hour. The land opened up around her gradually, flat scrub giving way to something wilder, more angular, the mountains blue and sharp in the distance. She could see why Nathan had loved it. Even dry, even blazing with summer heat, there was something about the scale of it that made the chest expand involuntarily. You felt small in it, but not the bad kind of small. The kind that reminded you the world was larger than your problems. She was thinking that, standing in the road taking stock of the quiet, when she heard the horses. She turned. 3 riders, coming from the direction of what looked like a ranch road to the east, cutting across toward the main track, moving at a deliberate pace, not rushing. The way men move when they're confident no one is going to challenge them. She recognized the one in front. She'd seen him yesterday, briefly, through the window of Ruth's house. The tall man in the dark vest with a silver star pinned to his chest. Ruth had told her the name without prompting when she saw Clara looking. That's Cutter. Don't look at him directly. She'd looked anyway. Wade Cutter was perhaps 50, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had gone flat and hard, the way a man's face goes when he's spent a long time making other people afraid. He had a mustache and cold, light eyes, and the particular kind of easy posture that comes from years of being the most dangerous person in any given room. He saw her. He pulled his horse to a stop about 20 feet away. The 2 men with him stopped as well. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "heard you arrived yesterday." Clara didn't move. Her heart was doing something fast and ugly in her chest, but she kept her face still. Word does travel fast. Small town. He looked her over slowly, her hat, her tied-up skirts, the direction she was walking. "You're heading out to Doyle's land." It wasn't a question. "I'm taking a walk," Clara said. "Long walk for a woman alone in this heat." "I'm used to the heat." He smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "I'm real sorry about what happened to Nathan. Terrible business." "Yes," Clara said. "It was." "You plan on staying in Red Hollow long?" She looked at him. She knew what he was asking. She knew the answer he wanted. She thought about Ruth's kitchen, and the thin mattress, and the 11 letters worn soft in her coat pocket. And she thought about the way Nathan had written, "I've been working this land for 8 years. The quiet pride of it." "I haven't decided," she said. Something shifted in his expression, just slightly. "Well," he said, "when you do decide, you come find me. I might be able to help you figure out your options. A woman alone out here? She needs to know what her options are." "Thank you, Sheriff," Clara said. "I'll keep that in mind." He held her gaze for one moment longer than was comfortable. Then he touched the brim of his hat and nudged his horse forward. The 2 riders passed her without looking at her, or perhaps too carefully not looking at her, which amounted to the same thing. She stood in the road until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she realized Her hands were shaking. She found Nathan's property an hour later. There wasn't much left. The house had burned hot and clean. Only the foundation remained, stone blocks blackened and cracked from the heat, grass growing between them already the way nature fills in what it can reach. A well that hadn't burned, its wooden cover gone. The post where a gate had hung, the ghost of a fence line running north toward the ridge. Clara stood in what had been the front yard and looked at all of it. She had imagined this place so many times from his letters. She had built it in her head, detail by detail. The porch he'd been meaning to repair. The kitchen window that faced east. The creak she would have heard from the back of the house on quiet mornings. She had lived in it in her imagination for 4 months. She had planned a life in it. All that was left was the foundation and the well and the mountains in the distance, unchanged and indifferent. She crouched down and picked up a small piece of burned wood from the edge of the foundation, turned it over in her hands, set it back down. She heard a boot on stone behind her. She stood and turned in the same motion, quick and alert, because Wade Cutter had recalibrated her sense of what was coming. The man standing at the edge of the property wasn't Cutter. He was taller than Cutter, lean where Cutter was broad. He was holding his horse's reins loosely, and he had clearly been watching her for a moment before she turned, though his expression, what she could read of it under the brim of a weather-beaten hat, was not predatory. It was more like someone trying to decide whether to say something. He had a scar that ran from just below his left cheekbone to his jaw. Not fresh, old, long healed to a thin, white line. He looked at the burned foundation, then at her. "You're the woman who came in on yesterday's train. Is there anyone in this county who hasn't heard about that?" Clara said. "Probably not." He wasn't apologetic about it. "I saw Cutter stop you on the North Road." She straightened slightly. "You were watching." "I was behind you about a quarter mile. Saw him ride up." He paused. "He say anything that was a threat direct, or just the kind that isn't?" "The second kind," Clara said. He nodded once, like that was the answer he expected. He looked at the foundation again. "Nathan show you this place in letters?" The question surprised her, the specificity of it. "Yes, he described it." "Did he describe the ridge?" "Yes." "The creek?" "Yes." The man was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her. "He talk about anything else? Anything he found on the property? Anything he was planning?" Clara studied him. He wasn't asking it the way Cutter would ask, smooth and angled, with a hook underneath. He was asking it directly, watching her face, and there was something in his eyes that was neither easy nor comfortable, but felt inexplicably more honest than anything she'd encountered since stepping off the train. "Who are you?" she asked. "Caleb Ryder." "Were you a friend of Nathan's?" A pause. "I knew him." "That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." The sun was punishing overhead. She was sweating through the back of her dress, and her water was gone, and she had at least an hour's walk back to Ruth's house. None of that seemed important enough to interrupt what was happening in this conversation, which felt like the first honest one she'd had since arriving in Wyoming. "He didn't mention anything unusual in his letters," she said. "But his last letter was different." Caleb was still. "Different how?" "He usually wrote about the land, the work, small things." She looked at the foundation. "His last letter was different. Shorter. He said—" She stopped, thought about whether she was going to say this to a man she'd known for 4 minutes. Decided she was past the luxury of caution. "He said there was something he needed to tell me when I arrived, that he couldn't put it in a letter. He said it was important, and that he trusted me to understand. Caleb's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, but she caught it. "When was that letter sent?" he asked. 3 weeks ago. He looked at the sky. Something passed through his expression that she couldn't name exactly. Not anger, not quite. Something heavier than anger. The weight of something he'd been carrying already. "You need to come away from this property," he said. "Right now." "Why?" "Because Cutter's men don't only ride the mill road, and they circle back on the north road in the afternoons. And you've already had one conversation with the sheriff today, which is one more than you should have had." He held out the reins of his horse. "I've got a second horse tied back on the ridge track. You can ride back toward town from there." Clara looked at his outstretched hand, the reins, the offer. She thought about every wrong decision she'd made based on trusting the wrong people at the wrong time. She thought about Nathan Doyle and his letters and his death and the burned foundation at her feet. She thought about the way Caleb Ryder had asked his questions, like a man who already knew some of the answers and was trying to figure out how much she knew. "Why do you care what happens to me?" she asked. He looked at her. For the first time there was something unguarded in his face. Not softness exactly, but the absence of whatever careful cover he'd been keeping. "Because Nathan sent a letter," Caleb said quietly. "Not to you, to me. And he said the same thing he said to you, that there was something he needed to tell me, that it couldn't go in a letter." He paused. "I got there 2 days too late." The heat pressed down on them both. A hawk turned slow circles above the ridge in the hard blue sky. Clara took the reins. "All right," she said. "Show me where the other horse is." They walked away from the burned foundation together, neither of them looking back. A woman with nothing left of what she'd come for, and a man with a debt he hadn't finished paying, heading up toward the ridge where the mountains were sharp and the air was fractionally cooler, and the trouble that was coming for both of them hadn't arrived yet. But it was coming. Clara could feel it, the way you feel weather before it breaks. Not a sound, not a sight, just a pressure in the air and the knowledge, deep and certain, that the sky is about to change. She kept walking. She kept her chin up, and she did not look back at the ashes. The second horse was a bay mare tied to a scrub oak on the far side of the ridge track, and she was better tempered than the situation deserved. Clara mounted without help. She'd grown up riding before Cincinnati took everything practical out of her life and replaced it with factory floors and coal smoke. And she settled into the saddle with the ease of old muscle memory, while Caleb watched her with a particular expression of a man recalibrating his assumptions. "You ride," he said. "I do a lot of things," she said. "Which way?" He didn't answer immediately. He mounted his own horse and sat there for a moment, studying the tree line to the east, with the focused stillness of a man who'd spent years watching distance for trouble. Then he said, "There's a cutoff trail that keeps us off the main road. Takes longer, but Cutter's men won't see us on it." "Then take it," Clara said. They rode in silence for a while. The heat was relentless overhead, and the trail wound through dry brush and cracked earth and the occasional twist of juniper that threw thin strips of shade across the path. Clara kept her eyes forward and her thoughts moving, which was how she'd always managed situations that threatened to overwhelm her. Keep the mind working. Keep the hands busy. Don't give the grief a door to walk through. Caleb rode slightly ahead, and she watched the set of his shoulders, the way he moved with his horse like it was an extension of something, rather than a separate creature. Whoever he was, he'd spent years on horseback. That much was clear. "How did you know Nathan?" she asked. He didn't turn around. "We rode together, long time ago." "As rangers?" A pause that was just long enough to mean something. Yes. And then? And then we didn't. She let that sit for a moment. The trail bent west, and the mountains appeared briefly between two ridges, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. He never mentioned you in his letters. No, Caleb said. He wouldn't have. Why not? He pulled his horse to a stop and turned in the saddle to look at her. And his expression was not hostile, but it was closed. The face of a man who had decided years ago that some doors stayed shut. Because the last time Nathan and I saw each other, it didn't end well. And he was a man who kept hard things to himself. Clara looked at him. But he wrote to you? Yes. Which means whatever changed between you, he thought you were still the right person to trust. Something moved in Caleb's face. Not much, but it was there. A small, involuntary thing. The kind that gets past a man's defenses before he can stop it. He turned back to the trail without answering and nudged his horse forward. Clara followed. She filed the moment away, carefully. Ruth was on her front porch when they rode up, and the way her eyes went first to Caleb, and then to Clara, and then back to Caleb, told Clara that these two people had a history that also hadn't ended entirely well. Ryder, Ruth said. Her voice was neutral in the specific way neutral is used as a weapon. Ruth, he touched his hat brim. She ran into Cutter on the North Road. Ruth looked at Clara. I told you, I know what you told me, Clara said. He came up behind me. I didn't have a choice about the conversation. She dismounted and handed the reins to Caleb, who took them without comment. He asked me how long I was planning to stay. Ruth's jaw tightened. And what did you tell him? I told him I hadn't decided. Ruth and Caleb exchanged a look. It was fast and complicated and contained at least 3 sentences of unspoken communication. The kind of look that only happens between people who've known each other through something serious. She needs to know about the letter, Caleb said. She knows about a letter, Ruth said carefully. She doesn't need to know about yours. Ruth, his voice was even. Nathan is dead, and Cutter stopped her on the road this morning. She's already in it, whether she knows the rest or not. Ruth looked at Clara for a long moment. Then she stepped back from the door. Come inside, she said. Both of you. The 3 of them sat around Ruth's small kitchen table in the thick afternoon heat, and Caleb put a folded piece of paper on the table between them. Clara looked at it. Nathan's letter. His last one. Caleb didn't unfold it. He told me he'd found something on his land, something significant. He didn't say what in the letter, just said he needed to show me in person and that I should come soon. He paused. He also said he'd met someone he thought was the right kind of woman, that she was coming out from Ohio. He glanced at Clara briefly. He said if anything happened to him, she might need help. Clara felt something go quiet inside her chest. The grief she'd been managing all day moved through her like a slow wave and receded. And what was left behind was something harder and cleaner. Not anger. Not exactly, but its cousin. He wrote to both of us, she said. Yes. He knew something was going to happen. He suspected it, Caleb said. Nathan wasn't the man who asked for help easily. Writing those 2 letters cost him something. Ruth poured water from the pitcher into 3 cups and set them down with the brisk efficiency of a woman who'd decided they were past the part where feelings got to slow things down. The question, she said, is what he found. Silver, Clara said. Both of them looked at her. The clerk at the depot. He was talking to someone when I came back out yesterday, and I heard, I didn't think it meant anything then. She turned her cup in her hands. He said something about the mountains north of Doyle's Range. Something about what a shame it was. The other man shushed him when he saw me coming." Caleb leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, with the expression of a man adding numbers that were coming out worse than he'd hoped. "Silver in those mountains would be worth considerably," Ruth said quietly. "More than considerably," Caleb said. "It would be worth killing for. It would be worth burning a house for." He brought his gaze back down. "And it would be worth coming after whatever Nathan left behind." "He mentioned something in his last letter to me," Clara said, "that there was something he needed to tell me when I arrived, that he couldn't put it in writing." She stopped. Then, slowly, because she'd been thinking about this since the burned foundation, since she'd stood in the ruins of Nathan Doyle's life and tried to understand why she was still in danger from a man she'd never met. "He sent me a package." Silence. "What kind of package?" Caleb asked. "I don't know. It was supposed to arrive before I did. He mentioned it in the same letter. Said he was sending something ahead for safekeeping, and that I should pick it up at the depot when I arrived." She looked at them both. "I forgot about it. When the clerk told me Nathan was dead, everything else went out of my head." Ruth and Caleb looked at each other. "The depot," Ruth said. "I need to go back," Clara said. "Not alone," Caleb said immediately. It wasn't a question or a negotiation. It was a flat statement of fact, delivered by a man who had already decided. "I didn't say alone." Clara pushed back her chair and stood. "I said I need to go back. When can we go?" They went at dusk, when the heat had dropped fractionally, and the main street of Red Hollow was quiet enough that 3 people moving through it wouldn't draw immediate attention. Caleb stayed at the end of the street with the horses, while Ruth walked Clara to the depot, because 2 women were less conspicuous than a woman and a scarred former ranger, and conspicuous was the one thing they couldn't afford. The same clerk was behind the counter. He recognized Clara immediately, and what moved across his face was a complicated mixture of guilt and relief, like a man who'd been carrying something heavy and was being offered the chance to set it down. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I wondered if you'd come back." "I was told there was a package for me," Clara said, "sent ahead by Nathan Doyle." The clerk looked at Ruth, then at Clara, then quickly at the door behind them. He leaned forward on the counter and dropped his voice. "It arrived 4 days ago. Before—" He stopped. "Before what happened. I put it in the back room. I didn't know who to give it to." He disappeared into the back and came out 2 minutes later with a flat oilskin packet, tied with cord and sealed at the edges with wax. Clara's name was written on it in handwriting she recognized from 11 letters. Nathan Doyle's careful, slightly leftward script. She pressed her hand flat on it and felt something rigid underneath the oilskin. "Miss Whitmore," the clerk said, low and rapid, "I have to tell you, someone's been asking. 2 of Cutter's men came by yesterday asking if there was any unclaimed mail for Nathan Doyle, or any package addressed to his intended." He swallowed. "I told them I didn't have anything. They didn't believe me. They'll be back." "When?" Ruth asked. "Morning. That's what they said." Clara picked up the packet and tucked it inside her coat. "Thank you," she said. "You took a risk keeping this." The clerk looked at her with the eyes of a man who'd been making small, cowardly decisions for years, and was surprised to find himself making a different kind. "He was a decent man," he said simply. "Nathan Doyle was a decent man." "Yes," Clara said. "He was." They walked back out into the last of the evening light. In Ruth's kitchen, under the lamp, Clara cut the cord and peeled back the oilskin. Inside was a folded piece of paper, and beneath it, carefully wrapped in a second layer of oilskin, a hand-drawn map. Caleb picked it up and studied it without speaking. His jaw was set. Clara watched him read it and knew from the careful way he was holding the paper that he was seeing something that confirmed something he'd already suspected, and that the confirmation was not a relief. "Silver," he said. "4 deposits, all on land that runs north along Nathan's Ridge." He set the map flat on the table. "This is a surveyor's map. Nathan paid someone to do this proper." "That's what they're looking for," Ruth said. "This is evidence," Clara said. "Not just of the silver. This is evidence that Nathan had legal claim to file before anyone else. If Cutter knew about this—" "Cutter knew," Caleb said. "Or suspected. That's why he moved when he did." He folded the map back carefully. "And now we have it." Clara looked at him. "What do we do with it?" "Federal marshal," Ruth said immediately. "Wade Cutter is a county sheriff, not a federal man. If we can get this to a federal marshal—" "Nearest federal office is 2 days' ride," Caleb said. "Then you ride," Ruth said. Caleb looked at Clara. "I'm not leaving her here." "I don't need—" Clara started. "Cutter's men are coming to the depot in the morning," Caleb said. "When they find out the package is gone, they're going to start looking. The first place they'll look is here." He glanced at Ruth. "She can't stay in this house." Ruth absorbed this without flinching. She'd lived in Red Hollow long enough to know the precise geography of danger in it. "Where then?" "My cabin's 2 hours north in the hills," Caleb said. "Cutter's men don't know about it. Nobody in town does except—" He stopped. "Except who?" Clara asked. He was quiet for a beat too long. "Except Nathan. And Nathan's dead." It should have been reassuring. Clara noted that it wasn't. There was something in Caleb's hesitation that she didn't have enough information to read yet, and she didn't like not having enough information. "Tell me what you're not saying," she said. He looked at her. His face was closed again, but there was something behind it. Something tired, like a man who'd been keeping a story at arm's length for a long time and could feel it catching up. "Not tonight," he said. "Tonight we move. Tomorrow I'll tell you everything." "Why not tonight?" "Because tonight we need to pack light and leave before anyone sees a lamp burning too late in Ruth's window." He stood up. "And because some things are easier to say in daylight." Clara held his gaze for 3 seconds. She counted them. Then she said, "All right, tomorrow. But you will tell me." "Yes," he said, and unlike the half-answers he'd been giving her all day, this one landed like a complete sentence. "I will." They left Ruth's house in the dark with Clara's suitcase stripped down to the barest essentials: the 11 letters, a change of clothes, the oilskin packet under her arm. Ruth stood at the door and held Clara's hand for a moment before they went. "You're braver than you know," Ruth said quietly. "I'm not brave," Clara said. "I'm angry. It looks similar from the outside." Ruth almost smiled. "Don't let him close you out," she said, with a small nod toward Caleb, where he stood with the horses. "He does that. It's not deliberate, it's just—" She paused. "He lost something important a while back, and he's still working out how to carry the weight of it." "We all are," Clara said. "Yes," Ruth said, "but his particular weight has your name on it, or close enough to it." She squeezed Clara's hand once and let go. "Be careful." Clara walked to the horse. The night was hot and deeply dark, the kind of dark that only exists far enough from a city that there's nothing to push it back. The stars overhead were extraordinary, the kind of sky Clara had not seen since childhood, before Cincinnati and its permanent coal haze had made her forget that a sky like this existed. She did not have time to appreciate it. Caleb handed her the reins without a word and mounted his own horse, and they moved out of Red Hollow quietly, at a walk, taking the back alley behind the church that Ruth had told them would keep them invisible from the saloon and the sheriff's office. They made it 3 blocks before the sounds started. Hoofbeats. More than 2 horses. Coming from the direction of the mill road. Caleb said one word, low and flat. Ride. Clara didn't hesitate. She pressed her heels in, and the bay mare responded immediately. And they were running before the thought had finished forming. 2 horses, in the dark, moving fast and silent through the dry Wyoming night, with the mountains black against the stars ahead of them, and the sound of pursuit behind them growing, and then, just as suddenly, fading. Whoever it was hadn't seen them, or hadn't followed. Caleb slowed to a canter a mile outside town, and Clara matched him, her heart loud in her ears, and the oilskin packet pressed hard against her ribs where she'd shoved it inside her coat. "They didn't follow," she said. "Not those ones," Caleb said. "Doesn't mean nobody will." They rode north toward the hills, and the dark swallowed them whole. And behind them, Red Hollow sat quiet and dangerous, and unaware that the map it had killed a man for was already out of its reach. For now, the cabin was exactly what Clara expected from a man who lived alone by choice. Spare, functional, and carrying the particular silence of a place that had never had to accommodate another person's presence. Caleb lit a single lamp and set it on the table without ceremony. The ride had taken just under 2 hours, and neither of them had spoken much, which suited Clara because she'd spent the time thinking hard about Ruth's parting words. "His particular weight has your name on it." She hadn't asked what that meant. She intended to ask now. She set her suitcase down and put the oilskin packet on the table and looked at him. "You said tomorrow. It's tomorrow." He had his back to her, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man who hadn't heard, but the quiet of a man measuring how much a truth is going to cost. He turned around. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." He looked at her for a beat. Then he pulled out the chair on his side of the table and sat down himself, and laced his hands together on the table, and looked at them for a moment like he was reading something written there. "Nathan and I were rangers together for 6 years," he said. "We rode into a lot of bad situations and rode out of most of them. He was the best man I ever worked alongside. Honest to a fault. Didn't know how to let a wrong thing go unchallenged, which is a good quality and a dangerous one." Clara waited. 3 years ago, we were sent after a man named Garrett. Gunrunner. He'd been moving weapons to some very bad people across the territory, and the Ranger Service wanted him stopped. He paused. "We caught him. Or we thought we did. Garrett had a brother nobody knew about. Younger, quieter, more careful. The brother got away while we were dealing with Garrett." His jaw tightened. The brother's name was Wade. Clara felt it land before he finished the sentence. Cutter. Wade Cutter was born Wade Garrett. He changed his name when he came north. Got himself appointed sheriff in a county where nobody knew his history. Caleb looked up from his hands. Nathan recognized him. About 4 months ago, Nathan wrote me about it. Said he'd seen Cutter in town and knew exactly who he was. Said he was building a case, gathering what he could, being careful. His voice went flat. He wasn't careful enough. The lamp flame moved in a draft from somewhere, and the shadows shifted across Caleb's face. And Clara stood very still and let the full weight of what he'd just said settle through her. "You knew who Cutter was when you found me at Nathan's property," she said. "Yes." "You knew he wasn't just a corrupt sheriff. He was already a wanted man." "A man the Rangers thought was dead, yes." "And Nathan's letter to you wasn't just about the silver." No. Caleb's voice was steady, but there was something underneath it. Something that had the texture of guilt. It was about both. He said he had the map, and he had a way to identify Cutter as Garrett. He needed me to take both to the federal marshal's office because he didn't trust anyone local. He stopped. He sent that letter 3 weeks ago. I was in New Mexico. It took 2 weeks to reach me and 3 days to ride here. He looked at her directly. I was 4 days too late. Clara breathed slowly through her nose. She was not a woman who fell apart in front of people. She was not going to start now. But the grief and the anger were moving through her in alternating waves, and she needed a moment to let them pass before she spoke. He trusted you, she said, even after whatever happened between you. He had no one else he could trust. A pause. And he knew I'd come. Whatever was between us, he knew that. What was between you? The silence that followed was different from the others. Heavier. Caleb looked at the table, and something crossed his face that was rawer than anything she'd seen from him yet. I had a family, he said. Wife and a daughter. 7 years old. He stopped, started again. After the Garrett case, the brother came back. He didn't come for me. He came for them. His voice didn't break, but it went very quiet, the way a voice goes when it's carrying more than it can hold, and it knows it. Nathan was supposed to be watching the house. He got pulled away on a call. He blamed himself. At the time, I blamed him too. Clara sat down. She hadn't meant to. Her legs made the decision independently. Caleb, she said. It wasn't his fault, he said, fast and definitive, like a sentence he'd had to practice saying. I know that now. Took me 2 years to know it. That's why I never answered his letters after. That's why he knew when he finally wrote again and I came. He knew I was coming, because I was finally done being wrong about it. The lamp burned steadily between them. Outside, something moved in the brush, and they both heard it, and both went still. And Caleb's hand moved to the rifle, leaned against the wall, with the automatic speed of a man whose instincts had never fully left the work. A pause. Then nothing. A night animal. That was all. Caleb set the rifle back, and Clara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. We need to sleep, he said. A few hours at least. They won't come tonight. They don't know about this place. You said that before, Clara said, and then said Nathan knew about it. Nathan is dead. Nathan told someone about his land, about the silver. Information got out somehow. She looked at him. Are you certain he didn't tell anyone about this cabin? The pause was brief, but she caught it. No, he admitted. I'm not certain. Then we sleep light, Clara said, and we figure out in the morning how to get that map to a federal marshal before Cutter figures out it's gone. Caleb nodded once, and she saw something in his face that was neither relief nor gratitude exactly, but was in the neighborhood of both. The look of a man who had been alone with something very heavy for a very long time, and had just felt someone else put their hands on the other side of it. There's a pallet in the back room, he said. I know, Clara said. I'll find it. She picked up her suitcase and walked to the back of the cabin and did not say anything else, because some moments don't need more words than they've already had. She woke to the sound of Caleb moving fast. Gray light, barely dawn. She was upright before she was fully awake, the 11 letters clutched against her chest in an automatic protective gesture that she noted with some distant part of her mind was telling. Caleb appeared in the doorway. His expression was controlled, but his eyes were sharp and wrong. Get dressed. We have to move. What happened? Horse is spooked. Someone's been on the property. Clara was already on her feet, pulling on her boots. How close? Close enough. He disappeared. She dressed in under a minute. It was a skill she'd developed in the factory years, where the foreman docked your wage if you were slow, and came out into the main room to find Caleb standing at the window, looking out at an angle that kept him from being visible from outside. I don't see them, he said quietly, but the tracks in the dust by the south fence, those weren't there last night. One rider or more? More. He didn't look at her when he said it. He was still watching the window. At least 3 sets of prints. Clara's stomach tightened. She picked up the oilskin packet from the table and put it inside her coat. Did they see the horses? Mine's in the lean-to. The bay is on a picket on the north side. He finally turned. We have maybe 15 minutes if they went back to report. Less if they didn't. Can we ride out the north side? There's a trail. It's steep and it's rocky, and it comes out on the back range above the tree line. He looked at her steadily. It's the kind of ride that tells you a lot about a person. Then you're about to learn something about me, Clara said. Let's go. The North Trail was exactly as advertised. It was barely a trail at all. More a suggestion of a path through rock and dry brush, climbing sharply enough that the horses had to pick their way with care, and Clara leaned forward in the saddle and kept her weight balanced, and didn't speak, because speaking would have required breath she needed for other things. They were 3/4 of the way up when the first shot sounded. It cracked off the rocks below and to the left, not close, but not distant either. They'd found the cabin. Clara's horse flinched sideways, and she brought her back with a hard pull and pressed forward without looking down. Caleb was ahead of her on the trail, and she heard him swear once, quiet and precise, and then say, "Keep moving, don't stop." She kept moving. The second shot came before the echo of the first had finished, and this one was closer. Close enough that she heard it cut the air somewhere to her right. And her whole body went cold and electric at once, in the way it does when something very dangerous has just passed very near. She didn't stop. She came over the top of the ridge behind Caleb with her heart hammering and the packet hard against her ribs, and the mare blowing hard beneath her. And she pulled up beside him and looked back down the slope. 3 riders at the tree line below. Too far for accurate shooting with a pistol, which was what they appeared to have. One of them had a rifle, but was fighting with a horse that didn't want to take the rocky ground. They won't follow up the back slope, Caleb said. The trail's too exposed. They'd be in the open the whole way, and we're above them. They'll go around, Clara said. Yes. He was already reading the terrain east, calculating. There's a pass about 4 miles east. If they know it, they can cut us off at the lower end of the back range. Do they know it? Cutter's been riding this county for 6 years. He looked at her. Yes. Then 4 miles, Clara said. How fast can we get 4 miles? Faster than them if we start now. They started now. The race across the back range was the most purely terrifying thing Clara had done in her adult life. And she had done some terrifying things. She had crossed a city on foot during the riots of '71. She had told her factory supervisor to his face that he was cheating the women on her floor out of their wages. She had packed a suitcase and boarded a train to marry a stranger. This was worse. The terrain was uneven and treacherous, and they were moving at a speed that left no margin for a misplaced hoof or a hidden drop. And Clara rode with everything she had. Every year of her childhood on horseback, every instinct she'd retained through a decade of city life. And she stayed with Caleb stride for stride and didn't fall. When they came down off the back range and hit the lower trail, and Caleb pulled to a stop, she almost didn't stop in time and nearly came off the mare before she got her pulled back. Pass is clear, Caleb said, reading the trail ahead. His chest was heaving slightly. "We beat them!" Clara bent forward over the mare's neck and breathed. Just breathed. For 10 seconds, she allowed herself nothing but the act of breathing. Then she straightened up. "New plan," she said. "We can't outride them all the way to the federal marshal's office. They'll catch us before we get out of the county." "Agreed. So we need someone to carry the map who they're not looking for." Caleb frowned. "Who?" "Ruth," Clara said. "They're not watching Ruth. She's an old woman who feeds people cornbread and minds her own business as far as they know." She looked at him. "We get this map to Ruth, and Ruth takes it somewhere safe while we draw them off." The look on Caleb's face went through several things in quick succession. She watched him examine the plan from multiple angles, the way a man does when he suspects an idea is good and is trying to find where it's wrong. "Ruth's tough enough," he said finally. "She rode out of tougher spots than Red Hollow back in her day." "What was her day?" "That's her story to tell." He looked east. "If we circle back into town from the south, come in through the church alley, like last night. We get to Ruth, hand her the map, and give her time to get out before Cutter knows what happened?" Clara met his eyes. "Can we make it before they circle back through the pass?" "If we move now." He held her gaze. "Clara." It was the first time he'd used her name. She noticed. "If this goes wrong—" "It won't," she said. It wasn't bravado. It was the same thing she'd told herself on factory floors and empty train platforms and standing in front of burned foundations. She'd said it enough times that she'd stopped questioning whether she believed it. She just moved as if it were true, and dealt with the consequences later. "Let's go." He looked at her for one more second with that expression she was getting more familiar with, the one that sat somewhere between reluctant respect and something more careful and personal that neither of them had names for yet. Then he turned his horse south, and she followed, and they rode toward Red Hollow with the map against her ribs and 3 armed men somewhere behind them, and the summer sun beginning to climb toward its worst heat of the day. They came into town from the south as planned, and Ruth was not on her porch. The door to her house was open. Clara was off her horse before Caleb had fully stopped, and through the door and into the kitchen with her hand on the small revolver she'd taken from Caleb's saddlebag on the ride down. She hadn't asked. She'd just taken it and checked the load, and he'd watched her do it without comment. And the kitchen was empty. Then Ruth's voice came from the back room. "In here! Don't shoot anything!" Clara let out a breath. Ruth was in the back room, wrapping her own suitcase with the methodical speed of a woman who had packed in a hurry before. She looked up at Clara and said, "Henderson at the store sent his boy to tell me. Cutter was in there at first light asking about you, about whether I'd given you a room." She yanked a knot tight. "I was getting ready to leave before you arrived." "We need you to carry something," Clara said. "I know." Ruth looked at the bulk of Clara's coat, where the oilskin packet pressed against the fabric. "Give it here." Clara pulled it out and handed it over. Ruth didn't look at it. She opened her blouse at the collar, tucked the packet flat against her sternum, and refastened herself with 2 buttons. Then she put on her good coat, despite the heat. "Where will you go?" Clara asked. "I have a sister in Cheyenne." Ruth picked up her suitcase. "Her husband is a federal judge." She paused, and something in her expression went briefly and privately satisfied. The look of a woman who has been holding an ace for just this kind of moment. "I've been waiting 8 years for a reason to visit her." Clara stared at her. "You knew," she said. "You knew all along that you had someone who could—" "I needed something worth bringing," Ruth said simply. "A dead rancher in a scared town don't move federal judges. A surveyor's map of illegal silver claims, and proof that a wanted criminal is operating as a county sheriff?" She snapped her suitcase shut. That moves federal judges. Caleb appeared in the doorway behind Clara, took in the scene, and said nothing for a moment. Then, "Ruth, when did you figure out Cutter was Garrett?" Ruth looked at him steadily. "About 2 months after he arrived. I wasn't sure until Nathan started asking careful questions about his past." She picked up her suitcase. "I've been building a quiet case of my own, Ryder. I just needed someone brave enough to carry the loud half of it." She looked at Clara. "Turns out she came in on the noon train." Clara felt something move through her that wasn't quite laughter and wasn't quite tears. It was the feeling of finally understanding the shape of something you've been standing inside of, seeing all its edges at once. "Go," Caleb said. "South Road. It's clear for another hour at most." Ruth walked to Clara and held her hand for exactly 2 seconds. No longer. "Be more careful than you've been," she said firmly. Then she walked out the door and was gone. Clara stood in the empty kitchen. The lamp from last night was still on the table, burned down to nothing. "Now what?" she said. Caleb checked the load on his rifle. "Now we give her enough time to get out of the county." He looked at Clara. "And now we let Cutter find us." Clara turned slowly and looked at him. "That's your plan? We let them find us?" "We let them find you," he corrected. "Specifically you, without the map. He needs to believe you still have it. It's the only thing that keeps him from riding after Ruth." "And what keeps him from just shooting me when he finds me?" "He needs to know where the map is first." Caleb's voice was level and flat and certain in the way of a man who'd made plans like this before and understood their costs. "He won't shoot you until he's sure he has what he needs." "And once he's sure?" "He won't get that far," Caleb said, "because I'll be there before that." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The morning heat was building through the walls of the house, and outside she could hear Red Hollow starting its day. A horse, a door, someone calling across the street. Normal sounds, oblivious sounds. The sounds of a town that had no idea what was happening in one small kitchen at the end of Church Street. "You'd better not be late," she said. "I wasn't late this time," he said quietly. "I won't be again." It landed differently than she expected. She felt it go through her and settle somewhere deep, and she didn't examine it too carefully because this was not the moment. She lifted her chin. "All right, Ryder," she said. "Let's finish this." The plan was simple, the way all dangerous plans are simple. Clean on the surface, full of places where everything could go wrong underneath. Clara walked out of Ruth's house alone. She walked down the main street of Red Hollow with her head up and her hands visible and the empty coat pressed flat against her ribs where the oilskin packet had been. And she walked like a woman who was carrying something important, because that was exactly what Cutter needed to believe. She made it half a block before Henderson stepped out of the general store. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her with those small, careful eyes, and then looked past her toward the sheriff's office at the far end of the street. And the look was so obvious, it might as well have been a shout. Clara kept walking. She went to the depot. It was the most logical place for her to be. A woman alone in a hostile town. No lodging, no allies she could name. Going back to the last place that had given her anything. The clerk saw her come in, and his face did something complicated, and she gave him one small shake of her head that meant, "Don't." And he closed his mouth and went back to sorting his papers with the focused attention of a man who had decided he was not present. She sat on the bench by the window. She waited. She did not let herself think about where Ruth was on the South Road. She did not let herself think about Caleb somewhere behind the buildings on the east side of the street. She thought about Nathan Doyle's letters, one by one, in order, the way she'd memorized them on the train. She thought about the particular way he described the creek on his land, cold even in summer, which doesn't make sense given the heat, but there it is. and she held onto that detail like a hand to hold in the dark. Cutter came in 12 minutes. He didn't come alone. He had 2 men with him. Not the riders from the ridge, different ones, which meant he had more people than she'd calculated. He filled the doorway of the depot with that particular ease of a man who had never in 6 years had a door not open for him. And he looked at Clara on the bench, and he smiled. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I was hoping to find you." "I expect you were," Clara said. He came in, and his men stayed at the door, and he pulled the chair from behind the clerk's counter and set it in front of her, and sat down with his hat in his hands, which was a performance. The reasonable man, the concerned official, just here to talk. The clerk had gone completely still behind the counter. "You had a busy night," Cutter said. "I slept fine, thank you." His eyes moved over her. Coat, hands, the flat place at her ribs where a packet might or might not be. "I heard you left Ruth Alderman's house in some hurry." "Ruth's roof leaks." "Does it?" He turned his hat brim between his fingers. "And you spent the night where exactly?" "That's my business." He studied her for a moment. The smile stayed, but something behind it cooled by several degrees. "Miss Whitmore, I'm going to be straightforward with you, because I think you're a straightforward kind of woman. You came here to marry Nathan Doyle. Nathan is gone. There is nothing left for you in Red Hollow. What I'd like to do is help you get on a train and go back to wherever you came from, with enough money in your pocket to start fresh." Clara looked at him steadily. "How much money?" "Enough." "How much is enough, Sheriff?" Something shifted in his posture. Slight. The adjustment of a man recalculating. $200, he said. "Cash. Today." The clerk's papers rustled faintly and went still. Clara let the silence sit for 3 full seconds before she said, "Nathan left me something." Cutter didn't move. Not a muscle. It was the stillness of a man who had been waiting for exactly this, and was now very carefully not showing it. "Is that right?" "He sent a package ahead of before he died. The clerk here held it for me." She paused. "You already knew that. What was in it?" "I don't know yet." She held his gaze. "I haven't opened it." It was a calculated half-truth. She had opened it, but he didn't know that, and if he believed she hadn't, it meant he still needed her. Caleb had been right about that. Cutter wouldn't move against her until he knew the map was in hand. "Where is it now?" Cutter asked. "Safe." "Miss Whitmore, I'll trade you," Clara said. He stopped. "Whatever Nathan left me," she said, keeping her voice flat and businesslike. The voice she'd used in 4 years of factory negotiations, where the only leverage you had was the ability to stay calm while the other person lost their patience. "I will give it to you willingly, in exchange for 2 things. First, the $200 you just offered. Second, a written statement in your hand saying that Nathan Doyle's death was a robbery gone wrong and that no further investigation is warranted." She looked at him. "I want it in writing because I want to make sure we understand each other." Cutter looked at her for a long moment. She watched him read her, the calm face, the direct eyes, the hands folded in her lap. She watched him decide what kind of woman he was looking at. A desperate one who'd stumbled onto something valuable and was trying to cash out safely. That was what she needed him to see. "Where is the package?" he said again. "Bring me the money and the paper, and I'll take you to it." He stood up slowly, put his hat back on. "You'll stay here." "I'm not going anywhere, Sheriff," Clara said. "I've got nowhere to go." He walked out. His 2 men stayed at the door. Clara looked at the clerk. He was staring at his papers like they contained the secrets of the universe. She could see his hands trembling from across the room. She clasped her own hands tighter in her lap and breathed slowly and thought, "Caleb, where are you?" He came back in 20 minutes. 20 minutes was a long time to sit on a hard bench with two armed men in the doorway and the knowledge that everything depended on timing you couldn't control. Clara spent it memorizing the grain of the floorboards and keeping her face arranged in the expression of a woman calculating her odds, which was accurate. Cutter set an envelope on the bench beside her. Beside it, a folded piece of paper. She picked up the paper first, read it. It said what he'd promised. His handwriting, his signature, the statement she'd asked for. It was also, she noted, a confession. Maybe not one he'd intended as such, but a written statement from the county sheriff declaring Nathan Doyle's death closed and no further investigation warranted, was, in the hands of a federal judge, exactly the kind of document that asked more questions than it answered. Ruth would understand that when she saw it, except that Ruth didn't have it yet, and wouldn't have it unless Clara could get it out of this room. She looked at the envelope, didn't touch it. The money. It's there. I'd like to count it. His jaw tightened. Count it. She opened the envelope with steady hands and counted $200 in bills, and replaced them, and folded the envelope and put it in her coat pocket. Then she put the folded statement in her other pocket. Now, Cutter said, the package. It's not here, Clara said. I told you it was safe. It's with someone I trust. The two men at the door moved fractionally. She felt it rather than saw it. Who? Cutter said. I'll take you to them. She stood. That was the arrangement. He looked at her with those flat, light eyes, and she looked back at him, and neither of them moved for a full second that felt considerably longer. All right, he said. Lead the way. She walked toward the door, and the two men stepped apart to let her through. And she walked out into the full heat of the morning, with Cutter one step behind her, and two armed men flanking. And she turned north on the main street and walked. She walked past the general store. She walked past the saloon. She walked past the church, and the sound of Cutter's boots behind her was steady and deliberate, and she could feel his patience thinning, the way you feel weather change. She turned down the alley behind the church. Where are you taking me? Cutter said. There's a root cellar behind the old parsonage, Clara said, not breaking stride. Nathan told me about it in a letter. He used it for storage when he came into town. He said if anything happened, he'd leave what mattered somewhere no one would think to look. It was a complete invention. Nathan had mentioned no such thing, but a root cellar behind an unused parsonage was exactly the kind of place a careful man might leave something, and it was exactly far enough off the main street to put some distance between this conversation and any witnesses. She needed Cutter in the alley. She needed Caleb in the alley, too. She pushed open the gate at the back of the churchyard and stepped through into the dry, weedy space behind the parsonage building and turned around. Cutter was 3 steps behind her. His men flanked him. There's nothing here, one of the men said. Give me a minute, Clara said. It's the far side of Miss Whitmore. Cutter's voice had dropped all of its performance, just flat and cold and finished. I think we've run out of patience with each other. He reached for her arm, and the voice came from the top of the churchyard wall. Cutter! All 3 men looked up. Caleb was on the wall with his rifle, and his expression was the specific blank calm of a man who had made all his decisions before the situation started. Step away from her. One of the men went for his pistol, and Caleb fired once. Not at the man, but at the ground 2 inches from his boot, and the crack of it in the enclosed space was enormous, and the man went completely still. I won't say it again, Caleb said. Cutter had not moved. He was looking up at Caleb with those cold eyes running calculations. The rifle, the angle, the distance, whether there was a play here that didn't end badly. Clara could see him adding it up. She could see the moment he decided there wasn't. "Ryder," he said, "you're nobody. You're a washed-up ranger with no badge and no jurisdiction and no—" "My name is Caleb Ryder," Caleb said. "Ranger service, retired. And your name is Wade Garrett, and there is a federal marshal's rider who left Red Hollow this morning carrying a surveyor's map of 4 illegal silver claims. A sworn statement from the county sheriff admitting he closed the investigation on a murder, and a formal identification of you as a wanted fugitive." He paused. "You can reach for that gun if you want, but the only thing it changes is whether you get a trial." The silence that followed was the loudest Clara had ever heard. She watched Cutter's face go through something she'd never seen on it before. The systematic collapse of a man who has built his safety entirely on other people not knowing what he knows, watching all of it come apart. It moved across his features like weather. Rage first, then something that was almost fear, then a hard, flat nothing that was worse than either. "You're bluffing," he said. "The rider left an hour ago," Clara said. "Ruth Alderman, with your written statement in her pocket." She reached into her coat and held up the paper. "The copy, that is. She has the original." Cutter looked at the paper. He looked at Caleb on the wall. He looked at Clara. And in his eyes she saw the specific moment a dangerous man calculates that the game is genuinely over. Not retreating, not regrouping, but over. And what he does next will either be the desperate move of a cornered animal or the stillness of a man who understands he's been beaten. His hand moved toward his pistol. "Don't," Caleb said. The hand stopped. A long moment. The heat pressing down on all of them. Somewhere beyond the church wall, the town went on making its ordinary noises, indifferent and oblivious. Then Cutter's hand moved away from the gun, slowly. "Get down here," he said to Caleb, "and I'll go quiet." "You'll go quiet anyway," Caleb said. "The question is whether you walk." Another silence. "Fine," Cutter said. And the word came out like something being cut loose, flat and final, and emptied of everything that had made him dangerous for 6 years. Caleb came down from the wall. He had Cutter's gun before the man could reconsider, and the 2 men with him disarmed with the speed of people who had calculated that their loyalty had a specific price, and it had just been exceeded. Clara stood in the churchyard and held Cutter's written statement in her hand, and felt the adrenaline moving through her in long, slow waves, receding now, leaving behind something that was exhausted and clear and very, very awake. Caleb looked at her over Cutter's shoulder. "You all right?" "Yes." She folded the statement and put it back in her pocket. "Are you?" "Yes." They looked at each other for a moment, across the length of the churchyard. Around them, the dry weeds moved in a faint, hot breath of wind, and the church wall threw a thin strip of shadow across the ground. And neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was something along the lines of, "We actually did it." Because saying it out loud, before Cutter was in a cell, felt premature. The town deputy, a young man named Ellis, who had spent 6 years doing what Cutter told him, and clearly carrying a conscience about it, appeared at the churchyard gate. He looked at his disarmed boss and his 2 disarmed colleagues, and Caleb's rifle, and Clara standing at the center of all of it with her chin up, and something moved across his young face that looked like the particular relief of a man who has been waiting for permission to do the right thing. "Deputy," Caleb said, "you want to help me put these men in a cell until the federal marshals arrive?" Ellis straightened. "Yes, sir," he said. And the sir was deliberate, not habit, not protocol, but a choice. A small one, but Clara had spent enough years watching people make small choices under pressure to know what they meant. She watched them walk Cutter through the churchyard gate and down the alley toward the sheriff's office. And she stood in the sudden quiet with her hands finally unclenched. And she pressed them flat against her thighs and breathed. The federal marshals arrived 3 days later. Ruth came with them, sitting straight-backed in the second wagon with her suitcase on her knee and the expression of a woman who had accomplished exactly what she set out to accomplish and had no intention of being modest about it. Clara met her on the main street, and Ruth took both her hands and looked at her with those sharp, clear eyes and said, "My brother-in-law is thorough. He sent 4 marshals." "4 is good," Clara said. "4 is excessive," Ruth said. But I wasn't going to argue with him. The marshals took Cutter out of his cell with an efficiency that managed to be both respectful of process and completely clear about its outcome. He walked out into the main street of Red Hollow in handcuffs, and Clara stood on the boardwalk and watched him go, and he looked at her once as they walked him past. She didn't look away. He did. That was enough. Around her she heard the town exhale, not dramatically, not with shouting or celebration, but in the quiet collective way that a place exhales when something heavy has been lifted off it. Henderson came out of his store and stood on the boardwalk, not saying anything. The 2 women in calico dresses from her first day appeared at the corner and watched in silence. The clerk from the depot was there, and he caught Clara's eye and gave her a small nod that she returned. Caleb came to stand beside her. They watched the wagon pull Cutter away down the main street, and neither of them spoke until it had turned the corner and disappeared. "It's done," Clara said. "The criminal part," Caleb said. "There's still the matter of the silver claims, Nathan's estate, the land. One thing at a time." She turned to look at him. He was watching the empty street where the wagon had been, and in profile she could see the scar on his jaw and the particular way he was carrying himself. Looser than before, but not fully loose, like a man still adjusting to the absence of something he'd been braced against for a long time. "You could file on the land," he said. "Nathan's surveyor's map and his documented intent to claim. The federal men say there's a strong case. He named you in correspondence as his intended. It's not nothing." "I know," Clara said. "You'd have to stay." She looked at him. He was still watching the street. "Would that be a problem?" she asked. He turned then, and she saw it again, that thing in his face that he was bad at hiding now, that unguarded thing that had been working its way to the surface since a burned foundation in the July heat. "No," he said quietly. "It wouldn't be a problem." She held his gaze. "Then I'll stay," she said. Not because of the land, not because of $200 in an envelope, or a surveyor's map, or a legal claim on a piece of rocky Wyoming ground. She said it because of 11 letters worn soft at the folds, and a burned foundation that had been the end of one story and, she was beginning to understand, the beginning of something she didn't have a name for yet. "Good," Caleb said. And the word was simple and direct, and carried about 10 times its own weight. Ruth appeared beside them with her suitcase, and looked at them both with the expression of a woman who had correctly predicted exactly this outcome several days ago, and was entirely satisfied with herself. "I'll put the coffee on," she said. Ruth's coffee was strong enough to strip paint, and Clara drank 2 cups of it sitting at the small kitchen table while the federal marshals did their work in the street outside. And Red Hollow made the particular noise of a town that had just remembered it was allowed to breathe. She was on her 3rd cup when the knock came at the door. Ruth answered it. Clara heard low voices, and then Ruth came back into the kitchen with her expression carefully arranged in the neutral way that meant the news was complicated. "It's Ellis," Ruth said. "The deputy. He wants to speak to you." Clara set down her cup. "Send him in." Ellis came in with his hat in his hands and the look of a young man who had rehearsed something and was now uncertain whether the rehearsal covered the actual situation. He was perhaps 25, with an honest face that had spent 6 years learning to look the other way and was clearly done with that particular education. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I owe you an apology." "You don't know me well enough to owe me anything," Clara said. "I knew what Cutter was doing." He turned his hat brim. "Not all of it. Not Nathan Doyle specifically. But I knew he was pushing people off land. I knew men were getting hurt. And I kept my head down." He stopped. "I kept my head down because I had a wife and a baby coming. And I told myself that was reason enough." Clara looked at him. "Is the baby here?" He blinked. "Yes, ma'am. 3 months old." "Boy or girl?" "Girl." "Then here's what you do," Clara said. "You do the job right from now on. You do it the way you'd want someone to do it if it were your daughter who needed it." She held his gaze. "That's the apology, not the words, the doing." Ellis was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, once and definitive, the nod of a man accepting terms he intended to keep. "Yes, ma'am." He put his hat back on. "There's something else. The marshals found papers in Cutter's office. Land transfer documents. Properties he'd acquired over the past 6 years by pressure or fraud. The federal men are saying most of those claims are going to be voided." He paused. "Nathan Doyle's property is on the list." Clara went still. "What does that mean?" "It means the land reverts. And since Nathan had no family and no other named heir..." Ellis stopped, looked at her carefully. "The marshals said your name was in his correspondence as his intended, that you'd been legally matched through an agency. It's not a marriage, but it's documented intent, and combined with what you went through to protect his claim..." He shrugged. "They're saying there might be a way to argue for the property." Ruth, leaning in the doorway, made a sound that was not quite a word but conveyed considerable satisfaction. Clara pressed both hands flat on the table. She thought about the burned foundation, the well that hadn't burned, the ghost of the fence line running north toward the ridge. She thought about Nathan writing, "I've been working this land for 8 years, and I still find things that surprise me." "Tell them I'll speak to them this afternoon," she said. She found Caleb behind Ruth's house, where he'd taken the horses after the marshals arrived, checking the bay mare's right foreleg, where she'd come down hard on loose rock during the ridge ride. He was crouched down with the mare's leg between his knees, running his hand along it with the careful attention of a man who understood that animals couldn't tell you where it hurt, and you had to ask with your hands. He looked up when she came out. "She's fine," he said. "Just tender." "Good." Clara leaned against the fence post and crossed her arms and looked at him. He straightened and read her expression and waited. She'd noticed he did that, waited, instead of filling silence the way most people did. It was the thing about him she'd had to adjust to first, and now couldn't imagine doing without. "Nathan's land might come back to me," she said. "The federal men are looking at it." He was still. "If it does," she said, "I'm going to need to know what I have." The map showed 4 silver deposits. "I have no idea what that means in practical terms, what it takes to file a legal claim, what it costs to work a mine, what the timeline looks like." She looked at him steadily. "I have none of that knowledge." "I know some of it," he said carefully. "I know you do." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to do it for me. I'm asking you to help me understand what I'm deciding." He leaned against the fence on his side, turned the information over for a moment. "Filing the mineral claim is the first step. That's federal paperwork. The marshals can help with that while they're here, which is the right time to do it." He paused. "The deposits on Nathan's map are on the ridge land, not the main ranch parcel, which means you'd need both the mineral claim and to rebuild on the ranch property to actually work it long term." "Can it be done?" He looked at her with that careful honesty she'd come to rely on.
With the right help and the right amount of time? Yes.
How much time? A year to get the claim filed and the first survey done proper. Another year to build. Maybe 3 before there's real income. He paused. It's not a quick thing. It's a long thing. I know how to do long things, Clara said. I did 4 years on a factory floor. She looked past him at the mountains in the distance. Nathan believed in that land enough to die for it. I'm not going to let that be for nothing. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, you'd need to winter here. First winter on the frontier is not... Caleb. He stopped. I'm staying, she said. I told you that. I meant it. Something in him that had been held at careful distance moved perceptibly closer. She could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure. Not dramatic, not sudden, but real. All right, he said. Will you stay? She asked. It came out more direct than she'd intended, which was fine. She was done with indirection. Not for the land, not because you owe Nathan something. For your own reasons, whatever they are. She met his eyes. Will you stay? He looked at her for a long moment. She let him look. She wasn't going to look away, and she wasn't going to soften the question. She'd crossed half the country to build something, and everything she'd brought with her had burned down, and she was building again, and she was not going to build something halfway. Yes, he said. One word, but it carried everything. The federal marshals spent 2 days in Red Hollow, and those 2 days reshaped the town in ways that would take months to fully understand. 3 men besides Cutter were arrested. 2 ranchers who'd been part of the land consolidation scheme, and 1 man from the county records office who'd been quietly altering deed filings for 3 years. 11 land transfers were flagged for investigation. 7 families who'd sold under duress were notified that their cases would be reviewed. Henderson came out of his store on the second morning and found Clara on the boardwalk, watching the marshals work, and he stood beside her for a moment without speaking, and then said, in the voice of a man who found apologies structurally difficult, I wasn't kind to you when you arrived. No, Clara said. I was afraid of Cutter. Most people were, Clara said. That doesn't excuse it. She looked at him. No, it doesn't. But it explains it. She paused. You have a store to run, and I'm going to need supplies come fall. We can start there. He turned to look at her, and she saw him recalibrate, the same recalibration she'd seen in the clerk, in Ellis, in the women in calico who'd come to her 2 days earlier and asked hesitantly if there was anything she needed. A town adjusting to the idea that the weight it had been carrying could be set down. I'll give you good prices, Henderson said. I'll expect fair ones, Clara replied. He almost smiled. It was a start. The marshals left on the 3rd morning with Cutter and his men in custody and a packet of documents that would occupy a federal court for the better part of a year. Before the lead marshal mounted up, he handed Clara a receipt, formal, stamped, and signed, confirming the mineral claim filing on Nathan Doyle's ridgeland, with her name on it as the claimant. She held the paper with both hands and looked at it for a long moment. Ruth was beside her. How does it feel? Ruth asked. Strange, Clara said honestly. I came here to be someone's wife. I'm going to be a mine owner instead. You were never going to be only someone's wife, Ruth said, with the certainty of a woman who had made accurate assessments of people for 60 years. Nathan knew that. It was why he wrote to you. Clara looked at her. How could he have known? He never met me. He read your letters. Ruth tucked her own coat straight in the morning heat. A man who reads carefully can tell a great deal from a letter. You wrote to him the way a person writes when they're done pretending to be smaller than they are. She paused. I expect he found that very appealing. Clara thought about, I think a person who can still be surprised is a person worth knowing. She thought about writing back. I have held on to it stubbornly for 29 years. He was a good man, she said quietly. He was, Ruth agreed. And he had excellent judgment about people, which is why he sent for Caleb, and why he sent for you, and why the two of you are both still standing. She picked up her bag from the boardwalk. Which brings me to my next point. Clara looked at her. What point? I'm going back to Cheyenne for a while. My sister has been asking me to visit properly for years, and I have apparently just given her husband enough legal work to keep him occupied for months. So this seems like the appropriate time. She looked at Clara with those clear eyes. You don't need me here. You know what you're doing, and Caleb... She paused. Caleb needs to be somewhere that isn't already full of me reminding him of things. He doesn't seem like a man who needs reminding of anything, Clara said. He doesn't need reminding of the past, Ruth said. He needs reminding that the past is over. She held Clara's gaze for a moment. I think you're doing that already. Better than I could. She squeezed Clara's hand and walked to the waiting wagon without looking back. And Clara watched her go with the feeling of watching a door close gently. Not an ending, but a shift. The world rearranging itself into a new configuration. It was Caleb who found the thing that broke her. Not broke her badly, broke her open, which is different. He'd ridden out to Nathan's property that afternoon to assess what rebuilding would take, and came back in the early evening with something in his hand. He found Clara on Ruth's porch and handed it to her without a word. It was a small metal box, scorched on the outside but sealed at the clasp. He'd found it buried under ash at the corner of the foundation, the part of the house that had burned last, where a man who was careful might have set something he wanted protected. Clara looked at it for a moment. Then she opened it. Inside, a photograph. A woman in a good dress. Not her best dress, but her good one. Standing in front of a building Clara didn't recognize, squinting slightly against bright sun. The photograph was creased at one corner, and someone had written on the back, in Nathan Doyle's careful leftward script, "The one I picked. Hope she's ready for Wyoming." Clara read it twice. Then she pressed the photograph flat against her chest with both hands and closed her eyes and let herself cry. Properly. Finally. Without managing it. She cried for a man she'd never met who had written her 11 letters and picked her out of a catalog of strangers and believed, with the uncomplicated hopefulness of a decent man, that they would get along just fine. She cried for the life she'd spent 4 years on a factory floor waiting to begin. She cried for everything that had burned down before she got there. Caleb sat on the step below her and didn't say anything. He didn't hand her a handkerchief or tell her it was all right. He just sat there, a steady, solid presence at the edge of her grief, and let her have it. When she was done, she wiped her face with the back of her hand and looked at the photograph again. She's ready, Clara said. Her voice was rough. She turned out to be ready. Yes, Caleb said. She did. She looked at him. The scar, the weathered face, the careful eyes that had been carrying too much for too long and were only now beginning to set it down. She thought about the 2 days they'd spent in this town since Cutter was taken away, working alongside each other with the easy efficiency of people who had already been tested by something serious and knew what the other one was made of. She thought about Ruth saying, "His particular weight has your name on it," and she thought she understood now what that meant. Not that she was responsible for him, but that she was somehow the right shape to carry it beside him. Different from him, but the right complement. She put the photograph back in the metal box and closed the clasp. "I want to go out to the property tomorrow morning," she said. Not to look at the foundation, to look at the ridge. The part Nathan said caught the morning light. "It does," Caleb said. "I can confirm that from this morning."
You went to see the light on the ridge?
I went to assess the structure situation. The light was incidental. She looked at him. He looked at the street. There was a beat of silence, and then she laughed. A real laugh, sudden and involuntary, the first one in days. And after a moment, he smiled, which was a rare enough event that she marked it consciously. It changed his face entirely, made him look like a man who had been young once and still remembered how. "Come with me tomorrow," she said. "To the ridge." "I was planning to," he said. "I need to measure the timber situation on the north slope." "Of course you do," Clara said. And she laughed again, and this time he laughed too, quietly, and the sound of it in the evening air felt like something being rebuilt. They went at dawn. They rode north as they had ridden twice before, but differently this time. No guns, no pursuit, no map pressed against her ribs. Just two horses moving through the early morning and the heat already building, and the mountains ahead. She didn't tell him about the letter she'd written. Not yet. She'd written it the night before, sitting at Ruth's kitchen table under the last of the lamp oil. A letter to her mother in Pennsylvania. The first one in 3 months. She'd described Red Hollow. She'd described what had happened, the short version, the version that would hold together without requiring her mother to sit down first. She'd described Ruth. She'd described the land. She'd described Caleb last, briefly, in terms her mother would understand. "There is a man here who has been a help to me. He is not an easy man to know, but he is honest, which I have decided is the quality I value most. I think you would approve of him. I think I will keep him around and see what happens." Her mother would read between those lines with the ease of 29 years of practice. They came up onto the ridge as the sun cleared the mountains. The light did what Nathan had promised, fell across the rocks and the dry grass in long, warm bands, turned everything briefly golden before the day hardened into its summer business. Clara pulled her horse to a stop and sat in the saddle and looked at it, and felt Nathan Doyle's ghost stand quietly beside her for one moment. Not sad, not accusatory, but something like satisfied. And then move on. "The one I picked. Hope she's ready for Wyoming." She was ready. Caleb stopped beside her. He didn't look at the light. He looked at her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. It was the first time he'd asked. She'd done most of the asking in this partnership. Asked for honesty, asked for help, asked him to stay. She marked that he was asking now. "I'm thinking about the first letter I wrote to Nathan," she said. "He asked what I was looking for. I told him I was looking for a life that was actually mine. Not borrowed, not given. Mine." She looked at the ridge. "I didn't get the one I was looking for." "No," Caleb said. "I got a better one," she said. He was quiet. Then his hand moved across the small distance between their horses and covered hers on the reins. Not romantic, not performed, just a hand over a hand, the simplest thing in the world. The gesture of a man who had been alone with something heavy for a very long time, and had finally found the right place to set it down. She turned her hand and held his. They sat on the ridge in the morning light above the land that was hers, that had been bought with loss and held with courage, and was only now beginning to become what it was supposed to be. And neither of them said anything. Because some things are better kept between the moment and the mountains. Far below, Red Hollow was waking up. Ordinary sounds, ordinary morning. A town that was smaller than its fear had made it, and larger than its courage had believed. It would not become a great place overnight. It would become one slowly, the way a damaged thing becomes whole, through the patient accumulation of better days. Clara looked out at all of it. She had crossed half a country to find this. She had arrived with a suitcase and a stack of letters and a name to go with, and nothing else. And she had stood on the platform in the heat and had the life she planned taken from her before she could even reach for it. And she had kept her chin up anyway. And here she was. Here, on this ridge, with the light on the rocks and her name on a legal claim, and a man beside her who had also lost everything, and also kept going, and had ended up, by whatever calculus the world uses for these things, in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time. The same time as her. She squeezed his hand once. He squeezed back. "We should get to work," she said. "Yes," he said. He didn't move for another moment. Neither did she. Then they rode down off the ridge together, toward the burned foundation and the well that hadn't burned, and the long work of building something that would last. And behind them, the light moved on across the rock the way light does, without stopping, without waiting, finding everything that's there and making it briefly, completely, worth seeing.